great to be here with you, Tom, and I guess what brought us here is our common background as diplomats, or somewhat former diplomats in my case, and also the fact that you served as ambassador in Beirut, and I served as ambassador in Istanbul, but then as special envoy for Syria. So maybe I should say we can start off on Syria, Lebanon.
Sure.
I think those are two very related subjects, and as I said, it has been my last post in this sense had been my most challenging and also emotionally draining. I mean, as diplomats, we are supposed to be very cool and rational and you know, not give in to emotions and so on. But actually, if you're working on a subject, you see this kind of suffering 24/7, and you're making little headway. Sorry, but I'm a bit emotional about it, so I just got
I'm glad
to say this. You know.
I'm glad you are. I mean, I think one of the important things people don't always recognise about diplomats is that, despite what you said about how often we're seen as almost quite cool and dispassionate and detached from subjects, in reality we're humans. We're like anyone else. We, you know, we feel these issues, and we're often very exposed to the grim realities on the ground. And I think no one 5 years ago, even the pessimists, no one was predicting it would get this bad. And every time in Syria you think you've hit rock bottom, you hear a knocking sound below. There's further to go. And I do think that as diplomats, we have a duty, an obligation, in fact, as the eyes and ears of our countries, to be telling people in our own countries quite how bad the situation is, and to make the argument that you cannot just ignore this. And what we've seen, particularly in the last year or two, is, you know, if you don't deal with the Middle East will come to you. And we've been reminded of that. And the rise of Daesh, the rise of migration and refugee flows have sent the clearest possible message to people in Western capitals that you can't just hope this crisis will end. One observation I have is that Assad has been a very fortunate man through this period. He has been fortunate in that he was acting in this way towards his people in a time when the world was distracted by the global economy, and at a time when much of the West was still reacting against interventionism in the Middle East. And I know, of course, in Arabic, the word for interventionism is also the word for interference. And so post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan, many of our own populations were slightly war-weary, but also slightly intervention-weary. There was a sense that, do we have to fix these problems? Can someone else not just fix these for us?
Well, this is the word intervention and interference. This touches the core of the discussion. Tadakhul, as they say in Arabic, and also you remind me of what used to be the slogan for the Assad supporters, is that Assad au nakhrak al balad, you know, either Assad or we will burn the country down, and this is what actually happened at the very start, 4 or 5 years ago. They made that threat, and they really made good on their threat. Now, I think this also raises the issue of the what used to be a popular concept, humanitarian intervention. And I think, you know, Libya started out like a humanitarian intervention to stop Benghazi from being destroyed and mass murder to take place. But then it moved on. I think this is an argument the Russians, for instance, constantly use now, that the UN Security Council decisions were misused actually for something for which it was not intended. Of course, now this is part of their arguments in favor of their intervention in Syria, but they don't call that tadakhul because it is at the invitation of the regime, which still occupies the seat in the UN, and of course the opposition. It enjoys some measure of international support, so that has eroded to some extent. But I think the concept of humanitarian intervention, that also touches on the predicament the United Nations itself finds itself in.
Yeah, you're right that that period at the beginning of the century in foreign policy was characterised by this, by the responsibility to protect.
Yeah.
And I think many of us as diplomats felt very strongly about, having seen what was going on overseas, that there was this obligation on us to try and prevent the worst things happening. This was the period, you know, as we went from Rwanda through Sierra Leone, through Kosovo, and in many ways, responsibility to protect, R2P, has hit the buffers in Syria. Syria has been RIP, R2P, if you like. And I think it's very sad that we haven't found a way to protect the most vulnerable in Syria. We have done enormous amounts. I mean, there's been more humanitarian aid going into Syria than to any other conflict in history. And there's been no shortage of political effort to unblock the crisis. But always when you have members of the Security Council who are so clearly on one side and blocking those efforts, it then becomes very, very difficult. I'm conscious though that, I mean, I think one of the weaknesses in the West often is that we spend a lot of time criticising ourselves. And often our opponents on these issues don't bother about
which is good,
being self-critical at all. But it's also one of our strengths. and I wouldn't want to swap it for anything. So my question to you is, do you think there is anything that we in the West could have done differently over the last 5 years?
Well, then I go into the realm of private opinions. Yeah, I'm not talking for my ministry, and I don't have to do that anymore. But I think I personally would have been in favor of like, you know, a safe zone to start and a no-fly zone, perhaps accompanied by a no-fly zone in northern Syria, at least to stop the barrel bombing of the Assad Air Force, because you know this is really asymmetrical warfare. You know, Assad has a full panoply of his air force at his disposal, which was supposedly to defend Syria against Israel, but the only way it was used actually is to bomb his own people. And you know, we stood by and we watched for years as whole towns and neighborhoods, not of villages, but of big cities, of Aleppo, of Homs, parts of Damascus, were completely destroyed. And now it continues, even with the Russians. I think so far they've already bombed 24 health clinics and schools. And so I always felt that this was irresponsible, you know, to let this go on, this barrel bombing, and not at least do something to stop it. So a no-fly zone there could have been a humanitarian gesture. No, but I wanted to ask you something, and that is, you've been working so hard on the humanitarian issue in Lebanon. You know, Lebanon is a country, it's an amazing country, because I think between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population is now refugees. You know, if you think of that in Europe, we complain about
it's unimaginable.
Refugees, you know. And you did such a fantastic work to and you still do, to provide education, because this will be another disaster, to have millions of Syrian school children having no education. How did you deal with that?
When I arrived in Beirut, we didn't have a development office or a humanitarian office in Beirut. By the time I left, we had a big office, you can imagine, and spending a huge amount of money in Lebanon, but also working with the UN on trying to get humanitarian support into Syria.
So that's a great feeling as a diplomat, to see that you really achieved something.
Yes, and also to be able to measure it, and to have the resource and to make that impact. And for me, you know, and this is why I'm still involved in it, the area where I thought we could really take a lead and make most progress was on education. Because you know, when you talk to people fleeing conflict, parents fleeing conflict, the first thing they say after they've got their family to security is, where's the school? How do we get our kids into school? And when you talk to the Syrian kids, they say, we want to study because we want to go home and rebuild our country. We want to be engineers, doctors, teachers, and so on. And so we've got to find a way, even while we're failing on the politics, we have to find a way to get education to those kids. And so we've got a plan now to get 1 million Syrian kids into school in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. We're fundraising around the region, we're fundraising in Europe, we're raising money from the private sector, because business can play a big part in this. Ultimately, we owe it to those kids. There's a moral reason for doing it. But there's also a pragmatic, practical reason for doing it. Because unless we get education to those kids in the region, we'll find there are more families attempting that perilous trip across the Mediterranean. And a tiny minority, but there are more kids who will be radicalized and will end up putting on suicide vests. So there's a really strong argument for doing this. It's one of the few things in diplomacy, I think, that everyone can agree on. Even the people we really disagree with on the politics.
You rightly point out that we don't want to see these kids radicalized and becoming extremists, and that there's also, I think you hinted at a very direct European interest also in working on education. It's not just idealistic, it's also a matter of well understood self-interest. And this brings up the issue of where are we going next now? I think what we see now happening with, for instance, Russian airstrikes being only for a small percentage targeted at IS. I think once they have consolidated their position in the West, they will be in a very comfortable position to take on the East, and also they don't have actually an interest in seeing Daesh or IS being defeated too fast in the East, so that other opposition groups can set up shop there. So we haven't talked so far about ISIS a lot. You know, it's the elephant in the room.
Yes.
We haven't mentioned, but this amazing country, Lebanon, you know, which was seen as a kind of failed state first, but now it seems like, you know, this is almost the best you can get in the area. IS doesn't seem to be able to get a real traction in Lebanon, right?
Yeah, well, it's got a little bit of traction, but not much. I mean, I agree with you. From the beginning of the conflict, Assad and Russia as well now, you see from their military strategy, have always wanted it to be about Assad versus terrorism. They didn't want any grey area. They didn't want any more moderate opposition group gaining any ground. And so everything we're seeing now is about making it that zero-sum game. It's me, my regime, or the terrorists.
Best example of zero-sum game.
Yes, completely. And so as a result, Daesh have thrived. And as a result, you know, it's almost the prophecy, the desire of the regime is coming true, that it is becoming harder and harder for others. But I believe Syrians deserve a much better choice than that choice between Assad and Daesh. I mean, what kind of choice is that? I mean, my theory on Daesh at the moment, on Islamic State, is that they are targeting the areas internationally where different faiths coexist. They don't care who they kill in those areas. They're quite happy to kill Muslims and non-Muslims. They're targeting the idea that we can live together. But what you've seen in Lebanon is the different communities coming together to reject that kind of extremism. And this is for a number of reasons. It's partly because the communities recognize the danger of the alternative. They've lived through it. They know quite how bad it gets when you go down that route. So there is a certain element of inoculation against that virus. But I was always, and still am, an optimist about Lebanon because of the quality of the human capital that I saw there. And so I do think that next generation can manage that transition effectively. But it's a tricky one. They have to retain the inoculation against sectarianism while finding a new way to run their own country.
I think I cannot remember anything like this, because you mentioned Rwanda, you know, and Bill Clinton, he famously said that the one thing he regretted about his presidency was not acting more promptly to prevent genocide in Rwanda. And now, you know, the numbers killed are going into that direction.
I mean, well, so I think you're right that, I mean, many of us who've lived through this period as diplomats and in government actually will be and should be held to account for many years to come about the decisions we took, the risks we didn't take. And you know, I think, including us. And I think, you know, in 20 years' time, I'll probably still be talking about this period and trying to understand, were there things we could have done better, could have done differently. When I arrived, you know, in the Middle East, at the kind of height of the Arab Spring, I used to go around saying the whole time that the biggest superpower in the region was the smartphone. And that it was the smartphone that was going to change the whole region, open things up very, very fast. I still am evangelical about the power of social media, digital media, to affect change in a positive way. But actually, you know, the smartphone didn't change the world as quickly as we hoped. It didn't prevent genocides. We always hoped that when you could actually document these kinds of atrocities close up, it would make them less likely to happen. Unlike, you started off talking about Hama in 1982, virtually undocumented, except by a few journalists who got in afterwards. Much harder now to do something like that, to carry out those sorts of atrocities without it being on the news all over the world. But we've often not used the smartphone as a superpower. We have failed on Syria to stop that conflict, and we cannot rest for a moment in trying to find a way to prevent that conflict getting even worse. But elsewhere in the world, you know, in 2015 we had the climate change agreement, we had the Iran deal. You know, there is progress, and the fact that the world has so many challenges, for me, doesn't mean diplomacy is dead. It just makes the case for better diplomacy.
And we have to use digital diplomacy for that as well. But it was a very good analogy you made with the first uprising in Hama, like what is it now, more than 30 years ago, because it was virtually unknown. You know, people came to our embassy in Damascus to tell us the story, and there were some stenciled papers, and that was all. And now everything is more, even the atrocities inside prisons and dungeons and torture chamber, you know, it's out there, and people will be held to account for that, thanks to these also to these tools. So, and I learned to work with it to the extent that it's useful. You know, I don't want to spend all my time on Facebook, but for instance, in my current work, studying, and of course I love the Arab world and Arab culture and literature. You know, this is what I started with as a student, and I still do, and that's why I care so much about it and about these wonderful people. And actually, this helps me now to be in much closer touch. You know, I'm doing research on Bedouin poetry, and so now I keep in touch with Bedouins in Saudi Arabia through WhatsApp. I never used it before, but now I get like these, you know, my New Year wishes in Arabic from Saudi Arabia.
From the middle of the empty quarter.
And I write back we have the Arabic touchscreen, and we can write in all languages and communicate. So this is really enriching.
I'm a huge fan of the way that we can use social media, not just to harvest information, but actually to engage people in new ways. I'm just finishing a book at the moment called Naked Diplomacy, which will be about the way that digital technology will change power in the period ahead, and the way that diplomats, but citizens more widely, can use these new tools to get back to where we started, to promote coexistence.
When is the copy coming out?
June the 2nd. I'm glad you gave me a chance to plug that. June the 2nd in London.
Okay.
Please, I'll send you a copy.
Send me a copy,
and maybe
I will send you a copy of my Bedouin poetry.
Good.
I don't know if you can link the two subjects up.
I'm sure we can. So maybe our next conversation will be on social media.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.